have you ever watched the documentary I sent before?
I had never seen it before, and I was spellbound. I just thank you so much for sending that documentary. I would have likely never seen it had you not, but I couldn't. It was like seeing it play out again in this country, except with slightly different, parameters, but very reminiscent of what happened to us in 2020. And I think that many conclusions that are drawn in that documentary about who is behind the subversion, I completely agree with. And I think that our elections are being subverted by the same parties.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And let me introduce about that documentary briefly. And the documentary name is Your One Vote is in Danger. So that documentary explains well about how did they manipulate the election result and commit the election fraud in 2020 general election. So it is like a Korean version 2000 Mules.
Yes.
Yeah. So 2000 Mules, which explains how did they take the presidential election in 2020 president election. I heard that you participated in making that documentary. So it's my honor to talk with you. And I believe that 2000 Mules shook the America. And I believe that that documentary awoke many Americans so that can see the truth. So there are thousands of obvious and undeniable evidence proving that there were.
Yes, similar things happened in the United States in our 2020 election. With under the fog of the COVID pandemic, so many rules were changed, and in our country, for the first time, there was a massive push to get Americans to vote using mail ballots, and so we saw some of the same statistical anomalies, counts that didn't make sense, but even more than that, what we saw was process failure, so that when people, concerned citizens and candidates, tried to go back and audit what had happened, there was no ability to do that because the process had so many gaps in it. And when I watched your documentary about what had happened in South Korea, I saw citizens gathering evidence and then presenting a case before the courts. And the first thing I noted was the length of time it took to try to get enough evidence, and the expression of many of the people in the documentary frustrated that all of the evidence was being held. And so they knew what had happened, but they couldn't prove it in full because they couldn't get access to all of the necessary information. That is exactly what happened in our country. We have an expression, it's a sports expression, when one team is trying to delay another team, they run out the clock. And so that's what happened in your country and in ours, that the efforts to keep quiet about what had occurred in 2020 used the advantage of holding all of that information and running out the clock until we could no longer receive that information, or we learned that it had never been collected in the first place. But then taking all of that, as you did in South Korea, to the courts, only for the courts to dismiss the cases. So as a concerned citizen, you are at a huge disadvantage because you're trying to work with the tools that you are given, expecting that the parties that you are working against will respect the law in the same way, but they do not. And therefore, it is a very difficult challenge that we face, very similar in both countries. And I think the solution in both of our cases, first, is recognition of God's hand at work in both of our countries, but through that to call up the citizens who will stay engaged and continue to press for more transparency. And I see that that's what's happening in your country, and that's what's happening here too. But that is in my opinion, the only way to reform is that the citizenry must demand it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think in America, they used the ballots as the way to manipulate and take the election result. And in my country, they used the early voting as the way to manipulate the election result.
Yes. How long is your early voting period? How many days before the election?
It takes 2 days before 5 days and 4 or 5 days before the election day.
In our country, we have early election periods that start over a month before the election day. So you can only imagine all of the manipulation that can occur in that period of time. So I understand the issue with early election and the ability to manipulate outcomes during that time.
Yeah, I agree. And I heard that many states in the United States, they do not require the ID identification at the voting sites. Is that true?
That is absolutely true. The United States does not have a standard form of identification. Some states do require that proof of identification be shown, but many states do not. And that is a huge problem here.
So I heard a few days ago that United States representatives of House, they passed the bill require the ID identification at the voting sites. So I pray that bill could pass at the Senate and in the United States, the justice may be established in the election and may the election integrity may be restored in the United States.
Thank you. I will tell you that, unfortunately, though that bill passed out of the House, it was called the SAVE Act, and it established, as you say, standards for identification, also standards for only U.S. citizens voting in federal elections. And it passed out of the House, but it was stopped in the Senate. And President Biden has said that he would veto it if it got to him. So it will not pass in 2024. Hopefully it will in 2025. But I do think it was very important for, even though we knew that it would not pass in this session, I think it was very important for America to see how their elected would vote on such a common sense bill that only improves the process. And it was a very stark contrast between our two political parties. And I think it sent an important message to American voters. And I think our countries are very similar in the way the citizenry has fought back. In our country, in the immediate days after 2020, there were many lawsuits filed. Most of those lawsuits were never allowed to be heard in court. They were dismissed on technicalities. And so there was not a true opportunity to ever present a full argument. One of those limiting factors was, as we discussed, the inavailability of the documentation that was necessary to really prove what had occurred. There were so many efforts to cover up or hide or not answer important questions about the standards by which our election was conducted. And so we learned a lot in 2020. And I think where we are now coming into 2024, some of those problems have been addressed. And not as many as I would like, but some have. I think that the most important thing, though, that has changed from 2020 to now is that the American citizenry, American voters, are more engaged than we have ever been in reforming a process and upholding the lawfulness of the process. And so it's still not as uniform or as secure as we would like it, but it is better than it was, even if only because American voters are now paying closer attention and less willing to just accept whatever the media says or accept whatever the popular culture is trying to push as its message. We now know that we have to see things with our own eyes before we can confirm, because there are so many lies that are happening now that we really must understand the rules and stay engaged so that we can see the truth amidst all of the efforts to suppress it. What we intend to do here in America is to make sure that there are every polling place has enough volunteers so that it will be more difficult to conduct these types of nefarious behaviors without notice. In 2020, there were not enough volunteers, and so hopefully bringing more people into the process will suppress efforts to undermine the lawfulness of the process. We are also fighting very hard already in the courts to change some of the standards, make sure that our voter rolls are accurate, make sure that the process will be followed and can be contested. We have certain states and the governors of those states that have passed legislation to prevent recounts, to prevent questions from being asked. So we are fighting against that now. But I think that the biggest thing that we can do is America and American voters must vote. We have historically one of the lowest voter turnouts in our country as compared to any country in the industrialized world. I believe, though, that in 2024, our election will see an outpouring of voters like never before. And I think that that could be the winning solution by just overwhelming the fraud by virtue of so many people who have never voted before for the first time now getting involved. But make no mistake, it will be a fight to the finish. And above all, I believe that it is God's will and whatever outcome that is, as long as we stand on the side of righteousness and listen and are directed by what we believe our Creator is instructing, and staying in prayerful obedience to that, then I believe that we will see justice restored, because so many miracles here are happening, like the prevention of the assassination by just inches. That, I believe, was the hand of God. I believe that we witnessed a true miracle. And I believe that those miracles will continue, but Americans must continue to stand and fight. God will deliver us to freedom, but we must stand and fight.